This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at numberfire.com. And this is episode 404 of the Late Round Podcast, one of the many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. I'm still here. Thanks for tuning in. I tweeted a thread about Leonard Fournette this week. I knew that he was polarizing in the fantasy football world, but I didn't know that he was this polarizing. I started the thread with, quote, Leonard Fournette checks almost every box that you don't want in an early round running back, send tweet. But then I followed that up with some thoughts on why I feel that way. I've got him at RB20 right now, and that doesn't seem that bad in the context of his running back ADP. And it's really not. But I would be taking basically all of the wide receivers in that range over Leonard Fournette, and here's why. One of the things that I don't think is helpful is looking at where a player finished during a previous season and simply equating that to the following year, especially a running back. Because right now at running back, we have perfect information. Everyone is healthy. We have players who finished below Leonard Fournette last year, like Alvin Kamara and Saquon Barkley, who are no longer hurt. And then on top of that, we've got a new rookie class that just came in with Clyde Edwards-Helaire and Jonathan Taylor. And there's some upside in second-year players like Miles Sanders and Josh Jacobs. So saying, but Leonard Fournette was the RB7 last year is kind of meaningless to me. Here's my overall general fear with Leonard Fournette, though. I think he's just another one of those RB2s who can absolutely live up to expectation on volume alone. That absolutely can happen. Similar to pre-injury David Montgomery. But I worry a lot about his ceiling in an offense that's projected to be pretty iffy. And it's a team with a 4.5 win over-under according to FanDuel Sportsbook. I've done a late round podcast episode on this topic before, episode 218, on how good players and good running backs in fantasy football often come from good offenses. Now, this was done in 2019, but according to the study that I did, of the 90th percentile or higher running back season since 2011 in fantasy football, half of them came from top 10 offenses. And for the record, I defined those offenses and which offenses were good or bad by numberfire's expected points model. Meanwhile, only 5% of the 90th percentile or better running back seasons were from offenses that ranked 25th or worse. And 77% of them were in offenses that ranked in the top half of the league. This doesn't mean that a running back in a bad offense is incapable of having a good season, you guys. It just means that it's harder for him to have that good season. That's a knock on Leonard Fournette. What's also a knock is the fact that his team tried to trade him this offseason. Maybe that means that they end up just riding Fournette into the ground this year. But maybe it also means that they don't care. Because they know they're not going to have Leonard Fournette next season. What if they want to see what else they have at running back? What if Raekwon Armstead sees more work than we're projecting him to see? Now, to this point, we can't assume that Fournette's workload is automatically going to translate from 2019 to 2020. There's a new offensive coordinator in town in Jay Gruden. And with Jay Gruden comes Chris Thompson, a pass-catching specialist. Now, say what you want about Chris Thompson and his ability to stay healthy. What's funny is the fact that Fournette's actually missed a similar percentage of his game since entering the league than Thompson has over his last 4 seasons. But let's just brush that aside. These are facts. Chris Thompson has seen at least 10% of his team's targets in each of the last 4 years. What if he digs into Leonard Fournette's high target share? It was a target share that allowed Fournette to see 100 targets last year. Now the retort back to me is, okay, you can cut that in half and he'd still see 50 targets. And I get it, but my fear goes back to what I said about this team overall. They're not going to be good. What happens if Jacksonville is in a negative game script and Leonard Fournette isn't their go-to running back? He's off the field. There are other running backs who are being drafted ahead of Leonard Fournette right now who are also in very mediocre to bad situations. Like Christian McCaffrey and Saquon Barkley also aren't in great spots. The difference is that not only is their overall backfield market share projected to be greater, but we know those two guys are not leaving the field because they're ultra talented. What if Fournette is more of a 2-down back with Chris Thompson in town? And Laviska Shenault too. We can't forget about the kind of football that he brings to the offense. 61 of Fournette's 100 targets last year came when the Jags were trailing by 7 or more points. And Fournette also ranked 4th among running backs in percentage of team running back targets, meaning the Jags were throwing to Fournette in that backfield at a very high rate. That all helped him see the 100 targets that he saw last year. Now, yes, positive touchdown regression is coming. You guys probably remember me talking about that relentlessly last year. But if the offense is bad, then that positive touchdown regression won't be all that significant. My greater point with Fournette is that there are a lot of red flags, and there seems to be a lower ceiling than where some people are projecting him. We can't just take previous season finishes and place them onto the current season. We can't assume that Leonard Fournette is going to have a similar role. Could he? Yes, of course. But we can't just assume that. And to me, it's easier to see the downside for a player whose team wanted him gone this offseason versus a running back on the opposite side of that spectrum. Fournette is becoming properly priced with his diminishing ADP. But in the third round, or in the fourth round ahead of some of those high upside wide receivers, that's where I'm not going to draft Leonard Fournette. Now, before getting into the questions this week, because this is a mailbag show, I want to let you guys know that best ball leagues are back on FanDuel. Unlike standard season-long fantasy football where you have to constantly make changes to your starting lineup and roster, you only have to focus on one thing and one thing only in a best ball format, the draft. All you have to do is draft a 20-player team and you're done. Each week, your top scoring players automatically start and will count toward your season-long total. The team with the most points at the end of the season wins. No setting your lineup, no waivers, no trades, just draft. It's the easiest way to play season-long fantasy football. For more details, visit FanDuel.com or download the FanDuel app today. Eligibility restrictions apply. First question this week is from @Miles_Gspoon. You've mentioned Cam as maybe the late-round quarterback to own this year. Does that mean you're also bullish on Patriots' skill players? Cam has to accumulate points somehow, but even with their discounted ADPs, I still feel dirty taking them. What am I missing? This is a good question, but I don't think that you need to be super bullish on Patriot pass catchers if you're into Cam being a good quarterback value. With the quarterback position, we're shooting strictly for upside. Cam has that upside. He's been a top 4 fantasy quarterback in 5 of 8 seasons where he's played a significant number of games. That's why we're into Cam Newton. And that upside is happening because of his rushing, not his passing. If he's used like he's been used historically, a large chunk of his fantasy points are going to come from the ground game. And that doesn't help his pass catchers. We've seen this happen with Cam in the past. Cam has only produced 4 top 24 wide receivers over his career. And then there was Greg Olsen, who was a very steady tight end 1. But Olsen-type numbers could easily be distributed in the Patriots' offense to multiple tight ends, multiple running backs, and multiple wide receivers. Basically, what I'm saying is you don't need Patriot pass catchers and skill players to far exceed their ADP in order for Cam to be a higher-end QB1. I think it's fine to target them and see if a player like N'Keal Harry hits. Sure. But it's not necessary if you're looking for Cam to hit, given how he scores points. This next question says, forgive me if this has already been covered, but can you discuss how your models like Damian Harris if he gets a crack at the RB1 job in New England? So if he gets the crack at the RB1 job in New England, my projections are going to like him because he has more pass catching upside or appears to have more pass catching upside than Sony Michel. And he's being selected late. That's a main reason that I've been drafting him over the last couple of months. He was one of the later round picks that I actually got in the Scott Fish Bowl. But in terms of my prospect model, it saw Damian Harris as pretty average. Part of that is because he shared a backfield in college with Josh Jacobs, so his numbers weren't that good. But then draft capital and his teammates score, that did give him a decent enough percentile ranking. But he was just pretty average overall in the model. My take is that I would be pleasantly surprised if Damian Harris is like some true RB1. I say pleasantly because I've drafted him a lot this offseason given his cost. But if you recall, I did an episode earlier this offseason on bailing on unproductive rookies. Generally speaking, and again, this is from a probability standpoint, but generally speaking, players who don't do much during their rookie seasons don't go on to be studs. That's what we're looking at with Damian Harris and also with someone like Darrell Henderson. If their costs were higher, I would not be buying into them, but they're not. The opportunity cost to get Henderson or get Harris is not significant. It's not a foolproof method to say, this guy sucked as a rookie, so he's never going to be good. It's just a probability thing. And at their cost, to me, it makes sense to invest despite what that data shows. So my model isn't like in love with Damian Harris, But when I'm not spending significant capital on someone, those models become a lot less important since you're chasing semi-outliers anyway. This next question is from @Mishugana. Any teams that drafted a top wide receiver or running back, but then drafted a second one later in the draft, and that's the guy we should be keeping an eye on / targeting? I mean, I think the obvious answer here is Bryan Edwards. The Raiders got Henry Ruggs in the first, and then they got a really good value in Bryan Edwards later on. And Edwards is apparently doing some good stuff in camp, according to reports. And I'm not surprised by it at all. Ruggs was someone I talked about who I'm fine with because of draft capital, and my model doesn't mind him as a result of that draft capital. But Edwards had the superior college production profile. It wasn't even close. Edwards had the best breakout age in this entire class. And despite the draft capital not being super great, he was an 85th percentile wideout in my model. Anything above the 80th percentile is really good. So Bryan Edwards, I think, is the obvious go-to answer here. This next question is from @PhilipWilson56. JJ, could you please explain potential contradictions to me? On your recent podcast, you gave your bold takes on the fantasy season, which appear to conflict with your 2020 rankings. I'm sure there is a simple explanation that I am missing. Many thanks for your fine work. Yeah, so just so it's clear, the bold predictions that I go through aren't based on my rankings. Rankings are a median outcome in how you think teams should hypothetically draft. I have my thoughts about rankings and why I don't think they're great for the fantasy industry as a whole, but that's an entirely separate topic. The bold predictions episode and article is about looking at multiple things breaking in certain ways. It's looking at the higher or lower range of outcomes. You can think of it this way. When I talk about players to avoid or target, I might be looking at like the 30th percentile outcome to the 70th percentile outcome. With bold predictions, I'm looking at the 10th percentile outcome all the way to the 90th percentile outcome. Instead of looking at more towards the median outcome, we're looking at the extremes. So those bold predictions won't always be reflected in my rankings. But I would assume that most players I was high on or low on in those bold predictions, that I'm high or low on them versus the consensus in my actual rankings. This next question says, theoretically, shouldn't Lamar Jackson have a higher than normal touchdown rate given the style of offense that he plays in? A lot of his plays between the 20s with no intention of getting a touchdown are runs when the normal system would be passing the ball. Yeah, I mean, I think it's fine to say that Jackson is going to have a higher than normal touchdown rate throughout his career, at least early on. But there's a difference between better than normal and 9%. Even a 6% touchdown rate is high. So sure, I think Lamar Jackson can consistently have a higher than normal touchdown rate. But I don't think it's logical at all to assume that he can maintain the second highest single season touchdown rate of all time. This next question is from @Beard06. What's the best way for fantasy football hardcores to take advantage of guys who only began taking interest in fantasy football just before the drafts? I think you're at an advantage because you understand what's happened over the summer when your league mates don't. So you know the journey that some players have gone through, but your league mates have no idea. But this year is also different in that we're really going off of reports when it comes to how certain players look and where they might land on the depth chart. And as a result, I think that we've become really reactionary. Players are often hyped in particular moments. Last week, N'Keal Harry couldn't do anything. He couldn't do anything right. Now the opposite is true. Ronald Jones couldn't catch a pass one day in practice. And then the very next day, he had a good practice. So if you were drafting on the day that Jones had a bad day, you honestly might have found value in Ronald Jones. That's how fragile things are. So someone who hasn't studied up may see the headline that Jones couldn't catch a pass in practice and then not draft him as a result. Whereas you know that Ronald Jones has gotten a lot of love out of camp this year and that Keyshawn Vaughn is behind after being put on the COVID list. So you may end up getting a value on a player like that. So it's important to utilize all the information that you've gathered, not just the most recent information. Others don't have that advantage. This next question is one of my favorite topics. It says, whenever a player moves teams, we try to project tendencies based on what they've done in the past. For example, Cam loves throwing to tight ends because Greg Olsen was his best receiver in Carolina. Is there any data to back this up, or should we treat these tendencies with a grain of salt? There's data that backs it up, but it's more of an issue of correlation and causation. Yes, Cam seemed to target Greg Olsen a lot in Carolina, but was it because Cam's tendency to throw to just any old tight end? Or was it because he had Greg Olsen, who was the best pass catcher on that team for years and years? Usually you can see how real these types of trends are when situations dramatically change. Take New England, for instance. Rob Gronkowski became a thing in 2011. From that time through 2018, New England averaged a tight end target share per season of almost 25%. There were 2 seasons where that number dipped well below that mark. One was in 2013 and one was in 2018. In 2013, Rob Gronkowski played only 7 games. In 2018, he wasn't totally himself. That led to his retirement. Then last year, without Rob Gronkowski in that lineup, no team targeted their tight ends at a lower rate than the New England Patriots. So does Tom Brady like throwing to tight ends? Or does Tom Brady like throwing to good tight ends? It seems like the latter makes a lot more sense. Now, this is similar for coordinator data. I'm far more interested in a coordinator's general philosophy than how he uses a very particular position. There's usually a lot of noise when looking at the positional stuff because that's often driven by personnel. You guys may not have been around the fantasy community years ago, but back when Kyle Shanahan was the offensive coordinator for the Falcons, people were touting Julio Jones as a great pick because Kyle Shanahan fed his ex-receivers. And then there was confirmation bias once the season ended because Julio had 203 targets in 2015. But then you dig in, and Jones's top target competition was Jacob Tamme. Roddy White was way past his prime. They had no other option. And when you're as good as Julio Jones, you'll get fed in that type of environment. And clearly that narrative doesn't matter because no one is using it today. So take all of that stuff with a grain of salt and take it case by case. Like, I think that there's some validity to the Phillip Rivers throwing to running backs thing given what we've seen historically. But don't let that type of narrative completely overshadow things and force you to make a suboptimal decision. This next question is from @SetiT. In bold predictions, you stated Terry McLaurin greater than Amari Cooper. You seem to have credited McLaurin for an increase in opportunity, e.g. Washington to pass more, Harmon with head bandage, etc., and Amari for a decrease, i.e. Lamb. But what about the loss of Cobb and Witten? How do you contextualize situations? So I know a lot of people look at vacated targets to put puzzle pieces together, but I just look at projections. Because it's more accurate since it's putting everything within the context of the current season, not the season that just happened. I think the bold predictions episode made people think that I believe these bold predictions are actually going to happen. Like they're the average outcome that's going to happen. They're bold for a reason. I have Amari Cooper ahead of Terry McLaurin. It's more so me saying that I think there's more downside than people realize with Amari Cooper, and McLaurin is a potential stud, hence the prediction. But regarding Cooper versus McLaurin and their potential volume, I contextualize it all with projected target share. That's how I build out my projections. And there's a scenario where Amari Cooper's target share is lower than expected, whereas McLaurin has a very, very high target share ceiling. So regarding the loss of Cobb and Witten, their vacated target shares are being spread around in my projections, not just their targets. Instead of looking at raw targets, I'm looking at the share of targets. This next question is from @FFSam2310. Thoughts on Claypool talk? If legit, who is left out of the Steelers wide receiver core for fantasy options? Now, I admittedly did not like Chase Claypool as a prospect. I talked about Bryan Edwards and where he ranked in my model earlier, and Claypool, despite better draft capital, was under that 80th percentile mark. Athleticism doesn't matter a whole lot in that model. But the reviews are there. People are loving Chase Claypool. And I said it when he was drafted, and I'm still on the same take. He hurts James Washington the most by far. Deontay Johnson is a better talent than James Washington, and he does more on the field than Washington can. Juju is the slot guy. Claypool would take over the Washington role if he truly, truly emerges. That's one of the main reasons that I've been a little skeptical on James Washington this offseason. This last question is from @fantasy_junkie. From a process standpoint, how do you approach trades? Now, this is something that I think fantasy managers get wrong all the time, and admittedly, you guys, it kind of puts me on tilt. Your consideration set for players to trade for should be huge. It shouldn't be small. You should not be very particular. I'll go through players to buy and sell on my 15 transactions episode each week, but that's mostly for process-related stuff. I mean, it's still fine to target individual players in trades. But when you do that, please, please, please look at the opposing team's roster and fill that roster with something that roster needs. There's nothing more annoying and frustrating than getting a trade proposal that doesn't make my team better. The goal of trading should be that both teams get better post-trade. You're helping a team get better at running back, they're helping you get better at wide receiver. You're giving a team more depth, they're helping you with an upgrade in your starting lineup. Target teams, not players. That's my process. Find teams that need help, that need the things that you have, and offer those things up. It's honestly no different than any other sale that you would make in the real world. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet subscribed to Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And if you could do me a favor, if you're listening on Apple Podcast, leave me a rating and review. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks, everyone. Appreciate you. Have a great weekend.